From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, I am Estefania Bravo. This is From the South. Hundreds of Brazilian students have gathered in Sao Paulo to protest against hikes in public transport fares. This is the third demonstration held against the increase in prices for the city's bus and subway services. The previous protests were strongly repressed by the police. Our correspondent in Brazil, Ignacio Lemos, has the details.
Brazilian students have gathered in a demonstration organized by the Passe Libre movement in Sao Paulo to protest against the increase of the prices of the bus and subway transport. The hike goes from 4 reales to 4 real 30 cents, 1 real to 1 real 15 cents for Sao Paulo citizens. There has been 2 more demonstrations for the same reason at the beginning of 2019. In the first one, the police repressed the students at the end of the protest. In the second one, the police repressed the students right at the beginning of the demonstration. So now students are worried about what is going to happen in this new protest. The governor, João Doria, has forbidden students to use masks, something students use to avoid being arrested.
We thank Nacho Lemos for that report. Hundreds of judges, lawyers, and trade unionists have also protested in Sao Paulo against the government's plan to abolish labor courts. Earlier this month, Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro said the labor courts provide excess rights for Brazilian workers. The move comes after the government abolished the Ministry of Labor. Venezuela's communication minister has spoken regarding the group of National Guards who went to a military post with the intention of stealing weapons. Minister Jorge Rodriguez said that 51 weapons were taken belonging to the Venezuelan armed forces. He said 40 have been recovered and that 11 are still in the hands of those who participated in the heist.
Some of those involved in Monday's robbery belonging to the terrorist cell Voluntad Popular have confessed that the weapons were to be delivered to civilians belonging to the Voluntad Popular terrorist cell. This is in order to carry out violent acts, injuries, and death during the demonstrations to be held on January 23rd.
And following the growing xenophobic attacks in Ecuador, Venezuela's foreign minister has announced 3 flights will be allocated for Venezuelans to bring them back home. The flights will leave Ecuador on Wednesday under the Return to the Homeland plan. This will facilitate the return of hundreds who have expressed fear amid the xenophobic campaign launched by Ecuador's government. Videos circulating on social media show a number of attacks targeting Venezuelan migrants in the northern city of Ibarra. And Venezuelans in Ecuador say they are fearing for their lives. They say that since the government announced tight air controls over them, racism has spread.
A lot of mothers didn't send their kids to school because they have received threats and derogatory content on their school chats. We are hearing complaints from all over the country.
The new government measures will create a bottleneck at the Colombian border with Ecuador, where they will not have access. Because of this process, which the national government and the foreign ministry know very well is impossible to get agilely like any other country will be able to do for its citizens.
Venezuela's Vice President Delcy Rodriguez has said U.S. Vice President Mike Pence has openly called for a coup in her country. Rodriguez's statement followed an earlier message from Venezuelan Information Minister, who said Pence was, quote, promoting instability and violence in Venezuela. The U.S. Vice President issued a video message supporting recent calls to protest against the government.
Because Mr. Pence doesn't have a job, now he wants to come and run Venezuela, handing out instructions on what should happen in Venezuela tomorrow, openly calling for a coup d'etat in Venezuela. I will say it like the Venezuelan people would say it to you: Yankee, go home. We're not going to allow you to intrude on issues of the country of Bolivar and the country of Hugo Chavez.
Thousands of auto parts workers in Mexico from 45 assembly plants are in week 2 of a massive strike. Dozens of workers have already been fired for helping organize the demonstration. They are demanding salary increases and bonuses. Bolivia Bolivia celebrates Plurinational State Day on the 13th anniversary of Evo Morales' inauguration as the first indigenous president of the country. Morales addressed the nation to speak about the advances in democracy and successes with political, economic, and social projects in these years. According to official figures, in the last 13 years, Bolivia's economy grew by 5% each year, putting it in first place for economic growth in Latin America. Our correspondent in Bolivia, Freddy Morales, brings us more.
President Evo Morales has provided a number of figures on how the country has changed in a positive way during the course of his 13 years in government. He elaborated on some information to help understand the Bolivian process, a structural process that the country has carried out. The school dropout rate, for example, now, with the use of a bonus, has been reduced by 8.5% to 1.5% over the course of these years. The government has implemented this bonus, which is paid at the end of each school year, as an incentive to people to enroll in school and to finish their education. It's a bonus which is received by all students for all school years and for all who take classes at public institutions. The result has been recognized by international organizations. Another important achievement spoken about by President Evo Morales is women's access to land. Before this administration, women did not have the right to hold a land title under their own name. Land could only be inherited by boys in the rural areas. This has changed, and now nearly 1 million campesino women have land titles for their properties.
We'll be back very soon. Stay with us. Welcome back. St. Lucia's main opposition Labour Party says it does not support the government's decision to vote against Venezuela at the OAS. Last week, the country's foreign minister stood by the decision not to recognize the Venezuelan president, Nicolás Maduro. Our correspondent, Alison Kentish in Castries, has the details.
After St. Lucia voted to not recognize the legitimacy of Nicolás Maduro's second term as president, the main opposition party's representative Ernest Hilaire says sovereignty should be upheld and St. Lucia should have taken a firm stance in support of Venezuela.
If we're going to become a pawn for other countries that will just use us, and they have done it in the past, and I give the case of Cuba, they've done it in the past. But at some point in time in history, you need to stand up and say, this is what I stand for. And you may be unhappy with me, but I will not join you on that journey.
This is the St. Lucia Youth Orchestra, one of the many projects set up with the help of Venezuela. Citizens who disagree with the government's stance say Venezuela has been a friend to St. Lucia and should not be abandoned at this time.
We have benefited tremendously from Venezuela, not only as a country but as a region. We have benefited tremendously. I don't think most St. Lucians understand the fact that we had Cuban doctors that were operating on St. Lucians here in eye clinics and other medical assistance to St. Lucia. Those doctors were paid by Venezuela. Many of us don't realize that. So while the medical assistance were given by Cuba, the financial assistance were given by Venezuela.
Well, I think that it is an absolutely bizarre situation, knowing that Venezuela has contributed so much to St. Lucia's development. You have both infrastructure and both in terms of the services that Venezuela helps with St. Lucia, and a country that also has strong diplomatic relations with each other. I think that it is a very unfortunate situation.
Last week, St. Lucia's Minister with responsibility for external affairs, Sarah Flood-Bobre, said despite the OAS vote, Venezuela and St. Lucia remain friends. For the opposition and concerned citizens, proof of the bonds should go beyond the lip service and include events such as the recent vote. Alison Kentish, Telesur, St. Lucia.
Peruvian textile workers are protesting against the new labor reform proposed by the government. Demonstrators marched to the Ministry of Labor in capital Lima. The textile workers' labor union fear that with this reform, the workers will lose rights such as holidays or family funds. More than 3,000 Hondurans and Salvadorians have crossed into Mexico in recent days. Guatemala's Minister of the Interior estimates that almost 3,000 Hondurans and more than 250 Salvadorians have legally migrated into Mexican territory. The minister says the Mexican government is handling the influx by installing 18 control points along their borders with those countries. More than 40,000 people have disappeared in Mexico in just 3 months. The figure has increased by nearly 3,000. Security forces have been accused of carrying out forced disappearances during the previous administration, including the high-profile case of 43 students who disappeared back in 2014.
For a decade, Maria Cristina has searched for her daughter Margarita. The number of people in Mexico officially registered as missing has exceeded 40,000. According to the National Search Commission. The commission offers renewed hope for victims' families.
We hope that there is progress now because I think families want to have a dignified burial for their loved ones and for them to be identified.
According to human rights defenders, the government of former President Enrique Peña Nieto failed to put systems in place to deal with this serious problem. That administration left the country without a state policy related to forced disappearances, so there was no system in place to deal with this national crisis.
We
do have serious criminality here. There are lands controlled by organized criminal gangs and also by public institutions that are part of this organized crime network.
Since the start of the war on drug trafficking during the term of former President Felipe Calderón, there was an increase in the number of reported cases of forced disappearances in Mexico. In many instances, these reports were ignored by the relevant authorities.
Because of the state's inaction, it's the families of people who disappear who were forced to conduct their own investigations.
The government of Andrés Manuel López Obrador has called for the election of a new National Search Commissioner and for the formation of a truth commission to investigate the case of 43 students of Ayotzinapa who disappeared in September 2014.
The López Obrador-led administration is expected to bring a new model of governmental intervention and work alongside the victims' families and civil society.
Social organizations fear that the number of cases of disappearances could be even double and may increase to 80,000 throughout the country.
A private plane carrying Argentinian football player Emiliano Sala has disappeared over the English Channel. The 28-year-old had just signed a record-setting contract with Cardiff, a Premier League club. Lifeboats and helicopters are searching the area looking for the plane, but so far there is no trace of the missing aircraft. Sala was on board with one other person and the pilot.
He meant a lot for this club. He always gave it everything. He was a fighter. He really had that desire. He was like a dog out on the pitch. When we saw him at the stadium, he was always very friendly with the supporters. He always had something to say to the fans, whether it was after a match or after training, whether we had a good match or not, whether he played well or not. He was always there to say something. He also had a lot of respect for the supporters, and we also had respect for him. He was one of the most liked and respected players.
The trial of former Panamanian President Ricardo Martinelli will begin on March 12th. The 66-year-old has been accused of illegal wiretapping and embezzlement. Martinelli has been in precautionary custody since last June after being extradited to Panama by the United States. He faces up to a 21-year prison sentence. A synagogue in Panama City has opened its door to 50 Polish pilgrims ahead of Pope Francis' visit to the country. The Pope will make his first trip to Panama on Wednesday for a gathering of more than 150,000 young Catholics at the World Youth Day Festival. An estimated 3 million people attended the last World Youth Day, and organizers in Panama are expecting similar big crowds.
We believe the message of opening arms, regardless of religious beliefs or differences we have, highlights what unites us. That is the message of peace, the message of coexistence and fraternity.
A Latin American journalism conference is taking place in Cuba, marking 60 years since Commander Fidel Castro launched Operation Truth. Latin American experts from around the world are meeting in Havana to discuss the challenges faced by journalists. The two-day event is backed by the Latin American Information Agency.
The phenomenon of lying and manipulation continues to generate great tragedies for the people. For example, in Brazil, there is a tragic effect resulting from a fake news operation. So, for the Latin press, the search for truth is unforgettable. And the democratic forces that forget the Latin press example and that of Operation Truth can pay a very bitter price. That's why the search for the truth is absolutely the soul of a revolutionary, transformational, civilizing journalism.
The movie Roma by the Mexican film director Alfonso Cuarón is leading the nominations for the Academy Awards. Roma becomes the first Latin American film with a nomination for the top-priced Best Movie, and her leading actress Yalitza Aparicio, the first ever indigenous woman to be nominated in the Best Actress category. The movie tells the story of a housemaid in a middle-class Mexican family. We'll be back very soon. Stay with us. Welcome back. The U.S. Supreme Court will allow President Donald Trump to enforce a policy banning some transgender people from the military. The conservative majority on the court voted today to lift injunctions issued by federal judges against the policy, while a legal challenge continues in lower courts. The Trump administration's policy bans from service transgender people who seek or have undergone gender transition. Members of Parliament in Britain are presenting a series of amendments to try to stop a no-deal Brexit. On Monday, the Prime Minister Theresa May had to present Parliament with her revised plans for Britain's exit from the European Union. That was after her deal with the EU suffered a crushing defeat last week. But her new plan showed very little difference from the previous one. And to get to know more about how migrants are dealing with the political situation in the UK, earlier we spoke with Emilio Morales. He's a Spanish migrant currently working in a marketing firm in Scotland.
And there's a lot of, as I told you, uncertainty and disbelief. People don't know what to do. People don't know if they need to pay, for example, for the settled status. Yesterday it was confirmed that we would not, but there's that sense of things changing really quickly, and we cannot really prepare for the future. So even though most of the people I've talked to would like to stay in the UK, some people are starting to think to go back to the respective countries. Every day there's a case of abuse towards a European citizen. Sometimes it's just verbal abuse, but sometimes it's physical abuse. For example, in London, many Spanish people have been abused for speaking Spanish in public transportation. So it's really scary.
And Telesur also spoke with UK Labour's Chris Williamson on Theresa May's attempts at negotiating a Brexit deal.
Well, Theresa May's made a complete mess of this whole Brexit negotiation. I mean, her original plan was voted down by the biggest ever margin in parliamentary history here, and she came back yesterday into the House of Commons virtually the same proposal. It seems that she's learned no lessons at all, and You know, in many ways, a lot of people are suspicious that she's simply trying to run down the clock to either force her deal through or to get a no-deal Brexit. Either way, it's been a complete disaster from the government's point of view in terms of negotiating a deal which is in the interests of the British people.
Despite its history of xenophobic attacks on migrants, South Africa has signed a UN global compact compelling governments to safeguard migrants' human rights. Our correspondent brings us stories of migrants struggling to survive in the country.
In 2008, South Africa came under the spotlight for xenophobic attacks that spread throughout townships around the country. While the world looked on in horror, Bongani Maphosa had been living in South Africa since 1992. He was already integrated into society and survived unharmed.
It hurts me because I don't think that anyone would leave their country for no good reason. We all escaped poverty, and that's why we're here.
Bongani arrived just 2 years before the end of apartheid in South Africa. Many black people were undocumented, and he says that worked to his advantage because he got to vote in the first democratic election, even though he wasn't a citizen.
We were given small handbooks. Everyone old enough to vote was given one of those handbooks, even though we had no IDs to vote with, and I voted for Mandela.
Zimbabwe remains home for Bongani. He just came back from there just a few days ago and says the situation is quite desperate.
The protests are bad. There's either no fuel, or when it's there, it's too expensive. Children are not going to school. There are no teachers. Clinics have no doctors because they're on strike. We don't know when this will end.
After 28 years living in South Africa, he says his documents are still not in order for him to be a citizen or permanent resident. He still needs a work permit, but he says he's found a way to make a living.
I survive by transporting goods for fellow Zimbabweans from South Africa. Many of them know and always ask me for transport for a fee.
Many migrants, especially those undocumented ones like Bongani, end up starting their own businesses as informal traders. Others just end up as cheap labor for restaurants. This may not be ideal for all of them, but South Africa remains a land of opportunity even amid xenophobia that prevails. Matuba Mahlachi, Telesur, Mabopane, South Africa.
Zimbabwe's High Court ruled that the government's internet shutdown is illegal. The court said Zimbabwe's government exceeded its mandate in ordering the internet blackout as protests against fuel hikes continue. Internet providers have been ordered to immediately and unconditionally resume full services to subscribers.
What the court has done here is to actually grant that order and go further and actually set aside the directive that had been issued by the minister. Why the court set aside the directive was because of a finding that has been made by the court to the effect that the directive was issued by the minister, who has no power in terms of the Enabling Act to issue such a directive. The power to issue a directive in terms of the Interceptions of Communications Act was reserved to the president himself, no other person but the president.
Meanwhile, Zimbabwean President Emmerson Mnangagwa has returned back home on Monday after abandoning his trip to Davos to attend to problems facing the country. The president condemned violent protests and has assured that any misconduct by security forces will be investigated. Kenyans pay tribute to people who were killed in a hotel attack in a Nairobi hotel complex that killed 21. People gathered at the hotel site for the ceremony along the manager of the complex. The victims included a Kenyan footballer, blogger, an American who survived 9/11, and two best friends, among others.
In their honor, we stand strong, very strong. May I please ask everyone to observe 1 minute silence in their memory.
And women in Eastern Ivory Coast are training to become certified commians or priestesses. The women are taught about traditional customs, properties of medicinal plants, and the techniques of conflict resolution. They are credited with the power to cast spells and predict the future. Training comes at a time when this tradition is threatened with modern society. The women belong to the 25 million strong Akan ethnic group. And with that story, we've come to the end of this news brief. These and other stories, as always, find them on our website at telesurenglish.net. And also join us on social media. We are on Facebook, on Twitter, and on Instagram. For Telesur English, I am Stefania Bravo. Thank you for watching.